What really happened with your host, Mike Rivero. The history the government hopes you never learn. Here is your host, Michael Rivero.
And aloha, America. Welcome to our show today. It's Thursday, December 28th, 2017. Sure happy it's Thursday. Sure happy it's Thursday. Sure happy it's Thursday. If I sound a little winded, it's because I had to take Claire to the doctor's again this morning and was racing back, and we got everything connected just as the opening music was playing. And closer than that, I do not care to be shaved ever again. So anyway, we're live. We're on the air. We have a lot of other stuff to talk about as well today. The phone lines are open, 800-313-9443. This is our next to the last show for the year 2017. And so, again, I would love to get some phone calls from people about what they think was good about this year, what they think was bad about this year, what they hope for the next year. Basically, this is our little look-back moment at what has been going on this last year, and there's been some good, some bad. We'll be talking about that as well. Okay, over in Alabama, the Alabama Secretary of State is planning on certifying the election for Democrat Doug Jones today. In fact, may have already happened, but Roy Moore is suing, claiming that there is evidence of voter fraud, election fraud, of which we know there was. And so they're still out there trying to say, well, he's an accused child molester. Well, a lot of people get accused of a lot of things. Doesn't mean they did it. But they're even still now trying to do this desperation of demonizing him to quiet down that issue of election fraud, because that is the biggest of the big lies. If the American people really wake up to just how fraudulent our elections are, and last year was an eye-opener for most Americans, then the whole charade begins to fall apart. We don't have any democracy here. The leaders of our republic are not chosen democratically, which is the way the system was set on up. We're living in a dictatorship where what you, the American people, want is completely irrelevant. And I think nothing illustrates that better than the video and photos that came out of Los Angeles. Welcome to Skid Row 2017. Apparently that got picked up. It's gone viral all around the net. People are looking at that and realizing we don't have a working economy in this country when we have that many homeless people. And our government places the incoming illegal immigrants and the refugees as a higher priority than American citizens who've been born here and lived all their life here. Because there's all kinds of assistance to help refugees and illegal immigrants get into our functioning system as much as it functions, and there's nothing there. There's no mechanism to help Americans who've fallen out the bottom climb back up and start all over again. It just is not there. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a phone call. Kevin in West Virginia, aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hey, Mr. Mike. A few days ago, you were talking about 2017 in review and
Yes.
looking back. I have a couple news stories that I think are pretty profound. The first one is the JFK release of the JFK files, and the reason why I find it to be very, very profound is it shows their tactics. The same tactics that they were doing back in the 60s are the same tactics, like with Mockingbird, that they're doing today.
Yes. The difference is today they don't work anymore. Back in the 1960s, the American people were very trusting of the corporate media and the government. They were very naive. They thought that when some politician was caught lying or the media made a mistake, that it was a unique occurrence. Today, it's very different. The American people understand the sheer scale of the lying in which we're all subject to by our politicians and by the corporate media.
Absolutely. The second story that I thought was very, very, very interesting, and I have a whole different take on this than most people, and that is the releasing of the black projects of the Pentagon. And the reason why I think this is because it proves my point that we can stop being addicted to oil with these alternative energies, and we can throw the shackles off the oligarchs and not only be true Americans, but be true world citizens too. I mean, if we can throw big energy off and being, under control of petro, I think we would be making leaps and bounds to being free.
Well, I disagree with you, because in a world that needs artificially created or generated energy, it doesn't matter if it's big oil or big wind or big solar or big nuclear. You're just changing one set of masters for another. unless we can come to a situation where every individual home is providing its own energy needs. And that's going to be a combination of new energy harvesting technologies like more efficient solar cells coupled with lower actual demand for energy. But as long as you have an organized society, you're going to have those individuals who will spend their entire lives getting their hands on, shall we say, the master control valve of that society in order to keep us all under their control. Now, the reason I'm in agreement that we ought to reduce our dependence on oil and gas is there's only so much of it out there. And even with the awareness now that petroleum is created by deep crust microbes, they can't create new petroleum products to keep up with how fast we're burning it up. And so there does need to be something else out there. Unfortunately, all of the green projects that we saw come out of Al Gore and the human-caused global warming movement turned out to be boondoggles, like the Solyndra solar cell disaster, windmills that don't work. There's a long way to go. But unfortunately, everybody's trying to find technologies that will plug into the existing infrastructure so that they can maintain ownership and control.
Totally understand your point, absolutely. And that's why I think this is needed, the discourse, with other people calling in and, and getting ideas out there. We can always agree to disagree, and I think that's awesome. And that's one thing in colleges that we don't have, and I'm so against the lectures, that we need to have dialogue. And I wish there was more of it.
Well, I'm in agreement on that, and what amazes me, because when I went to college, it was supposed to be a place where you explored new ideas and alternative ways of thinking about the nation, the government, the infrastructure, how things got done. And today, colleges and universities have become the most rigid enforcers of the existing liberal status quo, and they have become incredibly intolerant of anybody who's got a different idea other than what is being constantly regurgitated out of the liberal establishment.
Yeah, totally. I mean, where I go to school, I live in West Virginia, and I go to Hagerstown, Maryland, Hagerstown Community College. If somebody gets triggered, you can go and block off a half-an-hour block of time to go and pop bubble wrap. Give me a break.
Absolutely. The kids who are coming out of these universities, they're not equipped to deal with the real world, either in terms of being able to do a job, if one is out there to be done, or to deal with the adversity that one encounters as just a normal part of everyday life.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's all I have for you, Mr. Mike, and I want to say this to you, and I mean this with the bottom of my heart. Thank you for stepping up to the plate and doing what you're doing with all the ridicule and everything. You are a true hero and a true patriot. And I love you and Claire, and you guys are awesome.
Well, thank you very much for the kind words, and have a happy new year. We're going to switch on over to Ken in Fort Worth now. Ken, aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind today?
Hey, the Fort Worth Star-Telegram reporting today that Canada Railway can order 200 freight engines from General Electric to be built here in Fort Worth. Evidently, Trump opened up ANWR for oil drilling, and they need rail to get up there, and they have to have rail to haul the oil out. So that's what it's looking like. Won't they?
Trump is really pumping up the domestic production, and some of that is good because it does make us less dependent on the Middle East, which is headed obviously into turmoil that could disrupt oil flow, oil prices. The downside is that they're revoking a lot of safety and monitoring regulations that were put into place following the Deepwater Horizon disaster, and I do not agree with that, because anytime you stop watching what these large industries are doing, they'll start cutting corners to make a fast buck, to improve their profitability, and sooner or later they cross that line and they make a decision that leads to a disaster like the Deepwater Horizon.
Yeah. Hey, you got to call a little city up there, Trumpville. How does that sound?
Probably. He would be very flattered by it. And
you're going to have to build a town up there to have people who work there, and they got to take kids up there to school, and it's going to be quite a thing to watch do it.
Oh, yeah, it's going to be a boom town for a while, no question about that. But then if you've ever watched the TV show Ice Road Truckers, a lot of that centers on oil development exploration up there.
Yeah, and it's not easy to get up there either.
No, it isn't, but I imagine, between the trucks, between the new rail lines, and I'm sure they'll be investing in cold weather aircraft and airports. They may even contract with Russia, which is producing nuclear-powered icebreakers. The Russians know how to build cold weather shipping.
How far is that from the ocean?
How far is which from the ocean?
Anwar. How far is that from an ocean?
I don't exactly know, but I know that Trump is opening up some of the offshore areas for Alaska for exploration as well. So they're going to have some shoreline facilities.
Yeah. Hey, nice talking to you guys.
All right, thanks an awful lot. We're going to do a shout-out now to our on-air affiliates who are just now rejoining the network. Aloha, America. Welcome back to our show here. And getting into the news, Trey Gowdy is out there making an observation, and he's bang on with this one. The FBI has disappointed the American people. We've all been raised with a certain expectation of what the FBI is supposed to be, what they're supposed to be doing, and we're not seeing it actually materialize. And as we start to see more and more indications that the FBI was an accessory to the cover-up of Hillary Clinton's private email server, protecting her from prosecution, possibly accessories to espionage and treason as well, the American people are looking at the FBI and wondering just why do we have them? If their sole job is to be a 21st century American Gestapo, there to enforce the will of the tyrants, then they're obviously of no benefit to we the American people. And we have seen over the last several years how the FBI is trying to manufacture a positive public image by going on out with undercover informants and literally luring very susceptible, suggestible people into maybe thinking and talking about committing an act of terror. Then they'll swoop on down, arrest them, they'll get headlines saying FBI stops terror attack, and then 6 months down the road the judge throws the case out of court as obvious entrapment, which gets no reporting whatsoever. And so people are disappointed in the FBI. They have every right to be. My disappointment with them goes all the way back to 1994 and the murder of White House Deputy Counsel Vincent Foster. But a lot of people are out there now saying it's time, if we're going to keep the FBI, it's got to be drastically changed. And Representative Francis Rooney of Florida is saying it's time for a complete purge of all these deep state operatives from the FBI and the Department of Justice. This was in an interview on MSNBC last Tuesday. And Representative Rooney basically came on out and said he's very concerned that the Department of Justice and the FBI, whether you want to call it deep state or what, they're off the rails, meaning they're not doing the job we, the American people, think they ought to be doing. And then he went on to talk about how McCabe's wife, at the same time McCabe was supposedly part of the investigation into Hillary Clinton's email server, McCabe's wife gets $600,000 from Clinton-related sources while she's running for state senator. That's an obvious conflict of interest. McCabe should have recused himself. He did not. Now, there was an article over in Zero Hedge, The Anatomy of Hillary Clinton's $84 million money laundering scheme. And they start out talking about a decision by the United States Supreme Court, McCutcheon versus FEC, basically saying this opened the door to this labyrinth system of using state political party chapters as straw men and cutouts to get around limitations on donations to candidates and political campaigns. And that's exactly what happened with Hillary Clinton. And even in Donna Brazil's book, she mentions, yes, that a lot of money that was aimed at Hillary Clinton's campaign was donated to the state chapters and from them immediately forwarded along. And it was understood when the money came on in. You don't spend this. You don't get to do anything with it. You send it along to the DNC and Hillary Clinton's campaign. And so basically they are guilty of money laundering to evade campaign donation limits. There should be indictments and charges on that one. And it's amazing when you really get into it, looking not just at the fact that Hillary and Bill Clinton got away with a crime here and a crime there, the sheer volume of corruption, assassination, election fraud It's just astounding. And what does it say about the law enforcement of the United States of America that they have gotten away with it all this time? And, of course, we understand on a very abstract level, the government is afraid of the Clintons. The Clintons could blow the whistle on all that CIA gun and drug running out of Arkansas in the 1980s and probably a lot of other stuff as well. Scandals that could conceivably bring down the central federal government in its current weakened state, where it's out of money and has lost the trust of its people. It's actually in a very fragile condition, which is why I keep saying I foresee a Soviet Union-style collapse as what is going to happen to Washington, D.C. And apparently I am not the only person who is thinking this, because Ron Paul has come on out with an article saying U.S. on path to fascism on verge of collapse. Actually, I think we're already fascistic, but I would agree with Ron Paul on the other. The U.S. government is on the verge of collapse. And Ron Paul said that the apparent economic growth under Trump is an illusion because it's all in that stock market and financial market. And he says the American political system is on the verge of coming apart, similar to the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1989. This is Ron Paul saying this, not me. So apparently a lot of people are seeing the same symptoms that I am, and they're foreseeing the same outcome. We got to take another break for commercials, and we'll be right back. Aloha, America. Welcome back to our show here, getting on back to the domestic politics here. A lot of people are looking at Donald Trump's new national security strategy. And, again, one of my big disappointments for 2017 is the continuance and acceleration of the United States militarist policy towards pretty much the rest of the world. And I'll be very honest, the primary reason I supported Donald Trump last year was that I didn't want Hillary Clinton in that Oval Office. And I'm still convinced that had she won, we'd be in an even worse situation than we are right now. But this military policy has continued unabated, going all the way back to the Project for the New American Century. And it almost seems like whoever is president is no longer all that relevant in terms of the military policy, because it's still neocon thinking. Even when it was Barack Obama in the Oval Office, it was neocon thinking. And basically, the Washington foreign policy elites still look at the rest of the world as something to be conquered and brought under the control of the United States government. And I think the biggest single argument against that is taking a look at how the United States government has managed or mismanaged the United States itself. And for that very reason, I'm sure a lot of other countries around the world are saying, thanks, but no thanks. We'll run our own countries, and we'll probably do a better job of taking care of our country and our people than you do taking care of the United States and the American people. But it does seem like the neocons have never really left. They just changed which rocks they were hiding under. Let's go back to the phones. Peter in Los Angeles, aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Mike, Merry Christmas to you and Claire, by the way. It's the first time I've called since Christmas. Hey, your point about the corruption and how just absolutely rampant, and it's in every single fiber of our government.
Yes.
I would tell you that what the Clintons did is, and by the way, I think they were really shown the way in how to corrupt the government by the Israeli lobby.
Yes.
Who, for years, I mean, you could kill people, and if you paid off the right people with enough money, you could sink the Liberty or attack it and wipe out, all those people and so on and so forth. But the Clintons went and they corrupt everything that they touch, and any institution that they had influence over, they put people in. They brought it into the corruption web, which means that the entire government over their 8-year reign and more, with Hillary as Secretary of State, has been totally corrupted and put onto this deep state corruption thing and it's bipartisan, Mike.
Yes.
They're all in it both ways, and it is the government. It's not the corruption. It's not the deep state. It is the government.
Yes.
And Clinton corruption is the government.
Well,
So,
I don't want to. I want to give credit where credit is due, because it's not the Clinton corruption; it's the CIA corruption. Because if the CIA had not been using Arkansas as the base of their gun and drug running operations, they never would have approached Bill Clinton about coming on board with all of this. And Bill Clinton would still have been the former governor of Arkansas, and we never would have really heard all that much about Hillary. There's no question the Clintons were eager participants, but they did not initiate this cycle of corruption inside our government. That has been coming out of the CIA, and it goes way before the Clintons ever came to power, back to Vietnam, when the CIA was running heroin back into the United States inside the body bags of our dead Vietnam kids. To fund covert operations not approved by the Congress or the administration.
That's a fair point, Mike. I would then let me amend mine. The Clintons took that and they completely digested it all and took it in, and it metastasized. It spread. It went viral under the Clintons. But you're right. I think you can take this back. You can take this back to the CIA. I think that is the single. It really does need to be blown up, Mike.
Yeah, it really does. John F. Kennedy tried to do it, but again, there's another factor, and that is public awareness. Because back in the Vietnam era, and the CIA was doing these kind of things, but the American people were unaware of it because the corporate media kept it hidden. Now, since the mid-1980s, with the advent of the Internet and the independent media, the American people are now aware of what the CIA and the Clintons and all these other corrupt people are doing. And so it's not so much that the degree of corruption is increasing, although I'm sure it has. It's that the public awareness is increasing right alongside it. And more people are aware of what's been going on.
And Mike, you know, for the last year has like flashed it in neon. What you have been saying for years, and informed people have known for years, that the media itself is completely, not completely, but largely CIA controlled, and also it's just an organ of the deep corrupt state.
Well, the corporate media is functioning as a one-stop propaganda center, not just for the government and the CIA, but for corporate interests, politicians. The corporate media is for sale. They will gladly sell out their integrity and the interests of the American people in exchange for sums of money. We've seen that with Monsanto and their handling of GMO. We saw that in the Fox synthetic bovine growth hormone lawsuit. That's why we call them prostitutes and correspondents, because that's really what they're doing. They take their money and they put on out propaganda on behalf of whoever's paying them, and then try and pretend like they're some kind of guardian of the public interest.
Mike, by the way, just quickly, see, I just tuned in. Have you heard any news on that little Palestinian girl, that Emmet Tamimi, or whatever her name was, that little girl who stood up when her brother got shot in the eyes?
Well, Israel's authorities are moving her around, so nobody knows where she is, and apparently her Twitter account has now been deleted.
I'm hoping, you know, she's not being raped and tortured and abused, but that's a very real possibility.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. The Israelis do not see Palestinians as human beings worthy of respect.
What a courageous little girl. But, hey, Mike, listen, I'm going to let you go, but Happy New Year to you and Claire as well, and God bless you. Really glad that you're there.
Well, thank you very much for the kind words. Have a Happy New Year yourself. We're going to let you go. Now, getting on into the news at the war zones, and again, emphasis on the plural, the chief of the Russian General Staff has accused the United States of hosting a new training facility for ISIS fighters in Syria along the Syria-Iraq border. This is at Al-Tanf base on Syria's southeast side, and it's been under the control of the U.S.-backed New Syria Army and their U.S. Special Forces advisors since the area was captured from ISIS in August of 2016. And Russia has previously called this base a 100-kilometer-wide black hole operated by the U.S., wherein an assortment of unaccountable armed groups and militias can operate freely. So the U.S. is still there in Syria. They've still got a base there in which they're training these ISIS and Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups to try and turn the course of the war in Syria. Syria wants them gone. Russia wants them gone. All right, let's take another phone call here. Joe in Rhode Island, aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hi, Mike. Mike, the underground or illegal drug trade throughout the world, what percentage of I believe that this drug cartel around the world is supplying the financial needs of the globalists. It's supporting all countries of the world, and I believe this is a technique that they're using. My question to you, Mike, is what percentage of this drug trade is actually financing the globalists efforts to bring in the one world system?
That's a very hard question to answer, mostly because who is in control of what part of the global drug trade is shifting constantly. We know that the CIA has a lock on Afghanistan. They would like to have a lock on North Korea. During the war in Vietnam, they had a lock on pretty much all of the heroin coming out of the Golden Triangle from Burma and Kunsa. And that money was used not to necessarily prop up the one world government, but again, to give the CIA the money with which to carry out covert operations that were not approved by Congress or by the administration. The CIA went rogue a long time ago, and I'm sure their upper levels honestly believe they know what's best for planet Earth. And they could have all kinds of different agendas going on there. We do know that illegal drug trade of any contraband is used to change the politics of the country in which it's taking place. And a good example of that, of course, is prohibition here in the United States of America, where the rum runners and bootleggers had enough money to literally reshape the government to their own interests. And once the American political system had been changed, prohibition was repealed so that new up-and-coming rum runners and bootleggers wouldn't be able to be a threat to the new established order. And a lot of dynastic political families came out of prohibition days. It's been suggested, there's quite a bit of evidence to suggest, that the Kennedy family fortune came out of rum running and bootlegging, because at the start of prohibition, old Joe Kennedy was just middle class, didn't have a lot of money, had a little money, not a lot of money, came out of prohibition incredibly wealthy, had a legal liquor business, which he then sold off to a known gangster family, and then he took his money and he ran his sons for political office, including John F. Kennedy, Robert F. Kennedy, and Ted Kennedy. And old Joe literally had a plan of a 24-year Kennedy dynasty in the White House.
Yeah.
So now we have new political elites.
Answer as far as a global.
Well, to complete the point I was just making, now we have a new political elite that was raised and empowered in the drug trade, and that certainly includes the Clintons.
Mm-hmm. And how powerful is that today, would you say, Mike?
Well, it's immensely powerful.
Your estimation.
And the only thing that is going to stop it is public awareness that the corruption coming out of making drugs illegal outweighs the dangers of legalization of drugs. Because once prohibition was over and alcohol was available and taxed, that corrupting influence went away. And I think ultimately the same thing is going to have to happen here. People are just going to have to say, make all these drugs legal, tax them, regulate them, and then the purveyors of these drugs won't have enough money to literally buy the government out from under the American people.
Good point. Yeah. Mike, also, one other question, if I could. The New Age movement, what do you know about it?
Well, I've heard the phrase the New Age movement several times in several contexts, even going back to when I was in college. And back then it meant there was a turn of the epic, the age of Aquarius and so forth. New Age is also a music genre, so I'm not exactly sure in what context you posed that question.
Well, supposedly, I've heard from certain people that the Vatican City of the New Age movement would be Finehorn, Scotland. Does that ring a bell at all?
No, I'm afraid I'm going to have to say I'm not familiar with this particular meaning for New Age.
Okay. I'll let somebody else talk, Mike.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Mike.
Thank you very much for the phone call. We're going to switch to Ramsey in Canada. Aloha, Ramsey. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Sir, I just want to tell you something. Going into 2017, I would say the main positive issue for me is when the whole U.S. Election was hacked by Russia. That turned out to be a lie.
Yes.
Because I argued with a lot of people on this issue throughout the whole year, including with people on RBN. But you said the main negative thing for me this year is the damage of the statues and the whole U.S. embassy to Jerusalem. I would say those are the main problems for me.
Well, there's no question that Donald Trump's recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel has had major repercussions around the globe, and we haven't seen the end of that yet either.
Yeah. And so one quick question I have for you. You said yesterday that the president of Turkey, Erdogan, he's against Bashar al-Assad in Syria?
Well, he's all of a sudden started talking tough about saying it's impossible to go any further with Assad. And he's not very clear in terms of what direction he thinks everybody should be going. But Turkey, unfortunately, is proving to be a loose cannon on the deck because at one moment they seem to be more aligned with Western interests, and then all of a sudden they'll do something where they seem to be more aligned with Russia, China, and the Arab world. And I think it's reached the point where hardly anybody really wants to do business with him anymore because he's become unreliable.
Okay, thank you. Happy New Year.
All right, Happy New Year. We're going to let you go here. Now, speaking of Turkey, apparently Erdogan's attempt to pivot toward the Mideast Arab nations isn't going all that well. And Turkey and the European Union have had this ongoing friction since 2016. After Brussels expressed strong criticism of Ankara over the mass arrests in the country connected with the failed coup d'etat. However, apparently Erdogan is trying to patch up relations with the European Union and say, let's go back to talking about being friends, about having Turkey in the European Union, but so far negotiations are halted. So it may be that Europe has changed its mind about having Turkey in their bloc as well. Frankly, the European Union's got so many problems going on right now, I don't think they need any more chaos coming out of Turkey. We'll be right back after these commercials. And Aloha America, welcome back to our show here. One of the big issues we've had in 2017, and it was in 2016 as well, is this constant drumbeat of Russian aggression. Russia is aggressive. Russia's trying to expand. Russia's doing all these things. And yet it is the Western forces that are pouring troops and weapons along the border with Russia. And you're maybe wondering, how did we get into this mess? Things had calmed down. The Cold War had ended. Russia and the West were getting along fine. They were doing business together. How did it all go so wrong? And we're learning now that part of the problem is that once again the U.S. government has demonstrated this very bad habit of reaching agreements with other countries and then promptly violating them. And we're still seeing more information come on out from this recently declassified documents from the U.S., the Soviet, German, British, and French. and it's all being posted by the National Security Archive at George Washington University, in which it confirms once again that the Soviet Union went along with German reunification in exchange for a commitment from NATO that there would be no eastern expansion, that NATO would stop on that eastern border of Germany, and that was it. And obviously that is not what has happened. NATO has been trying to expand further and further into the Russian sphere of influence. So from the point of view of Russia, they're dealing yet again with promises made by NATO and the West that were not kept. And if you cannot trust other countries to keep their word, it sort of makes any kind of negotiations or discussions a waste of time. Stop listening to what they're saying and look at what they're doing. And this is a good example. Forget about all this talk about we promise we won't intrude into your territory, and look at what they're doing. Intruding into Russia's territory and sphere of influence. And certainly the now admitted U.S.-backed coup d'etat in Kiev is a perfect example of that. To take Ukraine away from merging with the Russian republics and drag them into the EU. That was the agenda. Now, apparently, the Russian Foreign Ministry is out there saying that the current situation in Ukraine violates the Minsk agreements, because the Minsk agreements said that Donbass would be granted special status within Ukraine, a nation within a nation, but with autonomy. And Kiev certainly is taking the other position, that Donbass will be brought firmly under the control of Kiev. And so now Russia is saying this is going to trigger a change of policy by Russia toward the Donbass to basically keep parity. Because once again, deals that were made, in this case the Minsk agreement, have been ignored and violated. Yet another treaty which seems to be heading into the trash bin is called the Open Skies Treaty. And this was a treaty adopted in 2002 which established a program of unarmed aerial surveillance flights over the territory of the participants. More about this when we come back from station identification. And aloha America, welcome back to our show, hour number 2. Phone lines are open, 800-313-9443. And we're talking about yet another treaty made by the United States, which is basically being abused. And this one is called the Open Skies, the Treaty on Open Skies, adopted in 2002. This was back when Bush was in office. And basically it was a treaty among 34 different countries, and it established a program of unarmed aerial surveillance flights over each other's countries to keep an eye on military buildup. Trust but verify. Now, prior to the availability of high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft like the SR-71, such surveillance was done entirely by satellites. And back then, the satellites used film, which they would take pictures, and the film canister would return to Earth, which actually triggered a lot of so-called UFO sightings. But it was very costly, very expensive. It wasn't very real-time, but it was basically done by both sides, by all parties involved, to verify that each country was complying with the various treaties limiting the numbers of nuclear weapons and nuclear missile submarines. And there were certain procedures when you were working on your missiles that you would have all the hatches and everything open, and everything would be visible to the sky because you knew you were being watched. There was that. Well, in the advent of robotic aircraft, surveillance aircraft, they moved to that, which is more real-time. And so in 2002, they had this treaty on open skies between 34 states in which each state was allowed to have unarmed surveillance flights flying over each other's country to make sure they were in compliance with various treaties. Unfortunately, Russia has notified the U.S. that because the U.S. Has basically been creating obstacles to the Russian Open Skies missions, that Russia is going to have to reciprocate and start blocking the U.S. flights over Russian territory. And so once again, Russia understands you can't believe or trust anything the U.S. government says. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. We're going to go back to the telephones now with Steve Elkins, who's a fellow RBN host here. And Steve, thank you for spending time with us today. What's on your mind?
Well, you've got some excellent calls today. You got a sharp audience out there, Michael. As far as the nuclear bomb thing here, I agree with you. I think the elitists do believe that that a nuclear war is survivable. But, you mentioned about the differences in the bomb itself, the nuclear bombs that we have today versus back in World War II. And I agree with you. We're talking apples and oranges here. These bombs that we have nowadays, very significant death and destruction. And neighboring countries on the target list would be suffering also. So I would hope that other nations who would be in that circumference of a hit zone from an enemy, supposedly, would put enough pressure to stop this insanity. But that's not what I'm calling about. I'm actually calling back that email I'd sent you on Trump to roll back Deepwater Horizon regulations. And I just wanted maybe your interpretation of this, because they talk about streaming the real-time information, the data of oil production to onshore facilities. So basically we know what's actually out there in the ocean being shipped and can be pumped in. But I also see this as possible because we're getting fudged numbers everywhere we go. Unemployment, everything is fudged numbers. I see this as a way maybe that the oil industry could also basically tell you there's a scarcity of the oil commodities, and actually just hike your prices up. What do you think about that? Maybe more of a monopoly type situation where they can tell you, yeah, we have very little oil here, but they actually have large reserves, and they know the reserves are there. But they simply jack the prices up for profit.
Well, certainly, if the ability for third parties to monitor the actual volume of oil being harvested is taken away, then we're at the mercy of whatever those oil companies decide they're going to tell us. And you're absolutely right. They could say, oh, the wells aren't producing, we don't have enough of a supply, and just jack the prices up very, very high. I'm just opposed to this idea of pulling back all oversight. Most of those regulations were put in the aftermath of the Deepwater Horizon disaster. And the issues they were dealing with there wasn't so much the remote monitoring of oil volume, but the idea that, like, the manual blowout preventer on the Deepwater Horizon was 4 years overdue for mandatory maintenance. And in virtually every other nation that is an oil-producing nation, they mandate automated acoustic blowout preventers that listen for the blowout and shut off the pipe automatically. And the United States does not require them. It's an expensive piece of hardware, about $500,000 per well. And I thought we should have had mandated acoustic blowout preventers back when Deepwater Horizon happened. That didn't occur, and now they're pulling back on the other safety regulations that were put in. In other words, we're going down that same path of reduced regulation and oversight that led to the Deepwater Horizon disaster itself, where you had the Minerals Management Service behaving more like they worked for the Deepwater Horizon owners and British Petroleum, rather than keeping an eye out for safety problems that threatened the local environment and population.
That kind of went off the radar for a while there. How long did it take to finally cap off that well with that gusher they had? How long did that take?
That took months, and they never really succeeded in capping it all off because as a result of the pressure, the ground around the wellhead fissured, and there's actually still small amounts of oil and gas leaking out through those cracks.
Well, that's it, Michael. Appreciate it. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much for the phone call, and we're going to go ahead and start with Tom in Indiana. Aloha, Tom. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Aloha, Mike. Aloha. I watched that Skid Row Christmas 2017, watched the whole thing, saw what the guy had to say, and I went and got on Google Map, and I went up and down those streets around that area. I found the exact center where he started that video. And I went 5 blocks in any direction, and after 5 blocks, there wasn't any tents. Now, I lived out in Los Angeles for a while. I know Los Angeles is a very big city, and also in the city that I live in, I know that there's people that scam the system. He showed some of the people that scam the system, But the crux of his matter was there was a lot of money being filtered into this area to these do-good associations and stuff, and it wasn't properly used. He said that the people that ran those organizations lived in castles, but yet there wasn't anything for the people to do on the street. Well, another thing I noticed about the video, if you go look at the video, how very well kept those tents were. There wasn't anybody living, and he interviewed some of the people there and said, oh, yeah, we have a job. We're just living down here. It costs a lot to live, you know, but we're waiting to get on the dole so we can get us a $50 a month apartment and let all the taxpayers pay for it, you know. So, you know, there's a lot of different ways of looking at it. They have a big problem in California. All our big cities have big problems, and we do have those people. And if you've ever lived in a big city, I mean, people that rent out houses and stuff like that, we know that people scam the system. They do it all the time. And
some do. Some do. Not all of them do. Anyway, Tom, got to let you go. Got to take a break for commercials. We'll be right back. Boy, that break went really, really fast. Okay, let's see. We've got another. Well, first of all, I want to respond to what Tom in Indiana said. Yeah, there are a lot of people who will scam the available social services, but I don't think that was their first choice. If we had an economy where there were plenty of jobs, good-paying jobs for the American people, and housing was affordable, food was affordable, I don't think living on the street and scamming anybody would be their first choice. And I think what some people may call scamming, others might call acts of desperation just to survive. All right, let's take ourselves another phone call. Dan in Washington, aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Yeah, thanks. I had a point about the story in Washington State about the human trafficking yesterday, or 2 points about that. But first, I want to agree with you, though, on the scamming the social services. I think there's homeless people all over, and we don't do enough to help those who really need it and just waste billions of dollars around the world, even though some people do scam. And, you know, we don't want generational welfare, but we could definitely do more, in my opinion,
but let's look at the other side of it. Everybody's trying to talk about, are the homeless people scamming the system? Some of them are. But look at the world's wealthy and how badly they scam the system. That's how they got wealthy in many cases.
Yeah, they scam it by the trillions. Homeless people, from what I see, they don't get much help at all. I mean, they got tents all over the place on underpasses now in the Seattle area and all over California, and you know, it's pretty tragic. I don't see anyone trying to help these people at all, and the mentally ill people living out there. And
well, you know, not everybody who's homeless is mentally ill or a drug addict or any of the other things. Like I said, Claire and I, when we were involved with this food distribution program at a local church, we got to see these people close up. We got to meet them and know who they are. And in a lot of cases, we were dealing with young people with brand new families that just had a streak of bad luck. And they came out here to Hawaii. They were promised jobs, and then the company that was going to hire them changed their mind or went out of business. You know, Hawaii's dealing with its own economic hardships right now. People can get trapped on this island because it is so far away from everywhere else. And it's not uncommon to see what we call bailout piles when we drive down the street, where there'll be the entire contents of a house just out on the curb for the heavy pickup, because the people living there decided they had to get off this island, and all they had money for was the airfare, and they had to leave absolutely everything else behind. You can tell that that's what these piles represent. It's not a room renovation. It's not somebody got a new living room. These piles have debris from every single room in the house, cookware, coat hangers, everything. You just know the house has been emptied because these people felt they just couldn't stay here any longer.
Yeah, I drive trucks. I've seen that all over California, and there's people living in trailers, like at the Walmart parking lot with families. Yes. And, you know, we're in a renting bubble, too. So, say the Seattle area, even 8 years ago, an apartment was, say, $700 a month. Now that's $1,400 a month.
Yes.
There's, like, nowhere for people to go, you know, and what are you going to do? You know? It's a horrible situation because they pumped up the housing bubble again, and inflated the prices again to help out the banks and the people that already,
Yeah, they're having to inflate the price of the housing, the houses and rental units to keep their mortgages above water. And that you're right, that's done to protect the banks. And the end result is that you have the American people, the American working people, can't afford a place to live anymore. We have these stories of people up in Silicon Valley who've got very good jobs with companies like Google, and they're still having to live out of their cars.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. And I guess my point, I kind of more on that now, but my point about the human trafficking, it seems like they're classifying normal prostitution as human trafficking. And then I just wanted to make the point, if they wanted to see human trafficking, they should go to, say, Eastern Washington and to an apple farm and see the bus loads of illegals and undocumented migrants all over the place. If they put a little effort into that kind of human trafficking, instead of trying to track down some guy that messaged Craigslist or whatever, it'd probably be a little more productive, I would think.
Well, they'd both be productive, but we need to remember that we're not dealing with young men and young women who just decided that since they can't get a job at Facebook, they're going to become a sex worker. We're talking about organized gangs who have persuaded young people to come to the U.S. from other countries with promises of jobs as models or something like that, and they wound up, being exploited sexually. That's what's meant by a sex trafficking ring. The young men and young women working in these sex trafficking rings did not start out intending to be sex workers, and that's why it's a much more heinous crime. As far as regular prostitution is concerned, like drugs, I really think it ought to be legalized, taxed, and regulated. And it's up to that person. If that's what they want to do with their bodies for their money, fine. But coercing somebody, trapping somebody to be a sex worker to make money off of them, that's on the same level as kidnapping, and it's a far more serious crime.
Yeah, I would agree with that part. Okay, yeah, it's horrible with the economy. It's just, I heard a statistic where the average millennial, people always give young people a hard time, like you're lazy and young people don't want to work. But I heard that the average wage of the millennial, if you count for inflation, has gone down like 30% in the past, since the 1980s even.
Yes. Yeah, when you have to figure in the inflation before you start attempting to compare the standard of living of today's young people versus, for example, my generation. Once you figure that in, you realize that, no, the standard of living for the vast majority of Americans is in decline. It's been in decline for 30 years. But the elites are doing very well. The top 0.1% gained $1 trillion in aggregate wealth this last year alone. And that is definitely a system that's out of balance.
Yeah, that banker bailout and the housing bailout with Obama and Bush and that whole thing just completely, it messed everything up for probably forever, I think. I think they just cut the standard of living in half just by doing that, it seems like,
Well, the reason for the bailouts, was very, very simple. Back when George Herbert Walker Bush was president, foreign investors were starting to get nervous about the U.S. economy. And so the U.S. government wanted to send out a message that the United States was still a safe place for investment, because if you invested your money in the U.S. and you made money, you got to keep it. But if you invested in the United States and you lost money, the taxpayers would cover the losses. So it was an all upside, no downside deal to keep foreign investment coming into this country. And the first actual demonstration of that was the savings and loan bailout. We were all told that we were going to have to bail out these SNL customers who were widows and orphan children and trust funds and the rest of it. But the vast majority of the accounts that were made good on the backs of the American taxpayer were these numbered, brokered corporate accounts for financial investment in this country. And that, of course, is absolute fascism when those who make money get to keep their money and those who lose money dump the losses on ordinary people. And we've seen it repeated several times since then with TARP, quantitative easing, 1, 2, 3, infinity. And that's the message they're sending out. The fact that it hurts the ordinary American worker is irrelevant to the idea of needing to maintain this illusion that the United States is a safe haven for foreign investment.
And for ordinary people, it just means your dollar's worth less, and then your social services get less, pretty much, right? And
yeah, and those social services are being soaked up by the refugees and the illegal immigrants.
Yeah. And one more point I'd like to make on that with Obama, that when the housing market crashed, he also let corporations start to buy houses and foreigners buy houses. And I was looking for a house at the time, and the housing prices just shot way up, way too fast. So that they were at their bottom when I bought my house, fortunately, but they just shot way back up. And now they're at insane bubble prices again, and now we're in even a rental bubble, so it didn't help the average person. I could see helping the housing market in some other way a little bit, but
well, the goal was to avoid the meltdown of 2008 by keeping all of the mortgages above water. And if you're not sure what I mean by that, a mortgage is considered above water if the equity value of the property exceeds the amount owed on the mortgage. If the situation reverses, if you owe more money on the mortgage than the property is worth, the mortgage is considered underwater. And when mortgages go underwater, people will voluntarily go into default. They'll walk away from it. And that was a big part of what happened back in 2008. So the reason for the rental and housing bubble is to protect the banks and the mortgage companies, yes, at the expense of the ordinary working American.
Yep, exactly. All right, thank you. Yeah, it's just that bubble is because the bubble was so high to begin with, so to bring it back up to that price, they're trying to protect that mortgage. Well, that just made it unaffordable for another generation of young people that wanted to buy houses. Now they can't.
No, they can't, unfortunately. The millennial generation will not have the same lifestyle that their parents did, by and large.
Oh. And thanks for taking the call, Mike.
You got it, and we're going to switch over to Kathy in Missouri. Aloha, welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hi, Mike. Can you hear me?
I hear you just fine.
Okay, great, because I'm not in a good spot. But I know people working right now full-time for wealthy business owners, and they are still on food stamps as managers, working like very, very hard as a manager. Happy, perky people. And they'd be grateful if they could get into any government, housing, but they're all full. And once you get into that government housing, you want to talk about ruthless, predatory competition. You know what I mean? The landlord can do anything they want to you once you're in there. You hear me? It's like a tragedy. So I don't know. It's like I know some of the people may wait up to save, but I mean, if you're working full time in America right now as a manager, I mean, you can't afford to even get your gas to go to work. Forget a car, all right? And I know people, full-time workers right now as managers, not the underling staff, who are still on partial food stamps, and they can't afford to get to work. They have to have help. So, yeah, I don't think these people are scamming the system like some people think, because the computer linkage today doesn't allow the scamming to go on. You understand me? If they're willing to live out on the street like that, to wait to get into one of these, most of these HUD places are godforsaken anyway. You don't want to live there.
Yes.
You hear me?
We have that here.
It's like those people have suffered so much. I don't even want to know what they've been through, why they're able to be so resilient to keep working and wait for some HUD to open, because most of these HUD places are not where you want to be.
Yeah. Well, we have some of those here. In fact, we have some just down the hill and over that away, and we drive past them all the time. And yeah, it's pretty abysmal. I think people, if they're willing to open their eyes and be objective, as they drive around their town, they're going to realize how decayed our entire society has become. Both government-supported housing, just older rental units and houses that haven't been maintained and kept up. You can see the deteriorated condition of our country, and that right there tells you we're an empire in decline. And unfortunately, our government may strike out in rage at the rest of the world in its death throes and cause a lot more damage on its way down. I remember when the Soviet Union collapsed, That was a big concern when the Soviet Union was collapsing. Was, would some Soviet leader who had a nervous breakdown as the government fell around them start turning the keys? And that was a very real concern back then, and it should be a real concern here as well.
Do you ever read that article? It was September 28th, I believe, The Guardian, Adjunct Professors Homeless. It's an excellent article, and they're working full-time, living in trailers with no heat. And one of my old pastor's wives in Dallas emailed me, and she said, well, you were wiser because you didn't go into the debt for graduate school, because I knew I couldn't pay the debt back, right?
Yes.
But I also got denied health care, but in a way it's kind of a blessing in disguise, because I've met MSWs from UW Seattle, and they were not able to move out of their crappy studio because then they had the debt load, even though they were, MSW, best one in the nation, top rated. But you know what I'm saying? It's a catch-22. So, but these are academics working full-time, PhDs from Columbia even, and they're still living in, trailers with no heat. And so it's just tragic. And there's a gentrification going on in this underbelly of housing, and trust me, I think they'd rather have crackheads and meth whores, do you understand me, than high-functioning people who don't want to live with roaches swarming the walls. Because you know what, a PhD from might make a phone call, Mike. We might want some action over here to, I don't have that situation right now, but I've certainly been in a very, very, I've been in dire housing situations with you have to lose your voice. And if you're a crackhead or a meth whore, or you just, drugged out all the time, I think you can probably lose your voice a little easier than someone like myself. So, yeah, trust me, they don't want anyone high-functioning in any of the HUD housing. You know what I'm saying? They want the lower element so they can get away with whatever they want. It's very sad.
Yeah, that's definitely true. They don't want somebody who's going to come on in and start agitating for improved conditions. And I've heard all kinds of horror stories about HUD housing where you're subject to random drug searches and other such testing because of the drug problem. But it's almost like the Bill of Rights no longer applies inside the HUD housing. And now, of course, that's spreading on out to the rest of the country. With that declaration of a 100-mile Constitution-free zone around our international borders. Well, for here in Hawaii, that's the entire state, where they're out there saying now the Bill of Rights no longer applies. It's actually up to we the people where the Bill of Rights applies.
I just keep telling people, just be good and, do the right thing, because honestly, we're in really dire situation. This is really not funny what's going on. When I'm meeting full-time workers that are half my age, that have a great attitude, no health conditions, they have no access to health care, they have nothing, they can't even afford to get to work, but they still have a great attitude. These are not whiners, okay? And they're still on partial food stamps. Imagine how I feel being the type 1 diabetic, right? You know what I mean? At 55, I'm like, oh my God,
yes.
I'm totally screwed.
Yeah, people, when they get to be our age, it can be very scary out there. If all of a sudden we had to find something else to do for work, who's going to hire somebody in our age? It's a very scary situation. Exactly. Kathy, we got to let you go. We got to take a break for commercials, and we'll be right back. And Aloha America, welcome back to our show. And Iran's parliament got together and basically voted through a bill declaring that Jerusalem is the capital of Palestine. And they're saying basically this is permanent. Iran will never change its mind on that. So we're still seeing the backlash from this stunt Donald Trump pulled. And at this point, it's clear that Donald Trump has made all of his Israeli friends happy, Sheldon Adelson, Bibi Netanyahu. But in terms of our foreign policy in the Middle East, it's been thrown into disarray. And that was not a carefully considered decision on the part of Donald Trump. And if it's one thing we demand of a president, it's they think things through. And they look at best case, worst case, middle case, before they just go along with what the cheerleaders around them are saying to do. Because this has definitely had, I think overall, this was a major foreign policy mess-up. Netanyahu was out there talking tough, saying that the region, the Middle East, needs to be mindful of Israel's superior, tremendous firepower. So he's out there issuing threats to these other countries and to Hamas. So it sounds like Netanyahu is getting ready to uncork some major battles because he's dealing with this corruption scandal. And apparently the Knesset did not pass that law making the prime minister immune from prosecution for corruption. And we're getting all these little hints being dropped by the Israeli authorities saying that there are some new revelations to come as to just how bad Netanyahu's corruption has been all this time. So Netanyahu may be looking at not being in office much longer, and he may think that a nice war with Iran might distract everybody away from that. You can't change leaders in the middle of a war. Just accept the corruption as part of the price of defeating Iran or Hamas or whoever. And the fact that the United States government would gladly leap in on Israel's side in a war against Iran, well, that's just a little side benefit as well. Now, we're seeing this rhetoric cranking up again about North Korea. Newsweek came on out with a particular piece of Beck's, how North Korea would wage war against the U.S., and Newsweek is out there saying that obviously North Korea will not attack the U.S. directly out of fear of nuclear retaliation. But then Newsweek goes on to say that North Korea might display their ire at the United States government by attacking South Korea or possibly Japan. And they're in there, Newsweek is just saying North Korea launching war. But it's very obvious it is the U.S. that wants war with North Korea, or at least is building up to the threat of war against North Korea. North Korea wants to be left alone, and that is why they're building weapons of deterrence rather than weapons of invasion. But there's a new insight into this coming out from truthout.org. And this goes all the way back to Dick Cheney and the neocons. And basically it says that North Korea had actually reached agreements with both the Clinton and George W. Bush administrations that would have bypassed this whole buildup of weapons and missiles. But Dick Cheney and his friends destroyed those deals in order to sell the idea that the United States needs to build a new ballistic missile defense system. Star Wars 2. And all the contractors will make huge amounts of money.
This is William, hopefully your favorite videographer from Two Hats Publishing. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you like it, please leave comments below, or like, follow, or subscribe to us and get notices of all our videos. We love it, even when you call.